Our New Testament reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." This is the word of the Lord. So, who here likes a good story? We all love good stories, whether it's in books or movies. And we generally start off with books when we're young children. And stories are there to teach us, to entertain us. They engage our hearts. They engage us emotionally, because whenever we're reading a story or watching a movie, we start to bond with some of the characters, the hero of the story. We're following him on this journey, and we can relate these journeys to our own lives. And so when the hero is stopped by something, it makes us think of the times when we've been stopped. And when he overcomes, it gives us hope for ourselves. Now, my undergraduate degree was in filmmaking, and my emphasis was in screenwriting. So for 4 years, all I did was study story. We watched countless movies, read many more scripts, and we studied in depth what we call the hero's journey, everything that happens from beginning to end on this journey. And I want to take a look at the Zacchaeus story through that lens of storytelling. So we have our beginning. Our location is in Jericho, and Jesus is passing through. We meet our protagonist. It's a man named Zacchaeus, and the text tells us 2 specific things about him. He's a tax collector, and he's wealthy. So we learn a lot about Zacchaeus. As a tax collector, he kind of went against a lot of his fellow people and is taking money from them. And we all don't really like giving taxes, so we can understand how he might have been treated. And the text also tells us that he is rich. And as a tax collector, we probably could have guessed that, but the text points it out for a very certain reason. It's trying to emphasize the richness. And I think Luke is setting us up to understand something, because in Luke 16, Jesus says, "No one can serve 2 masters, for he will hate one and love the other, or he will despise one and be devoted to the other. You cannot serve God and money." And right after this happens, a young ruler who's rich comes up to Jesus and asks, "What do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus tells him to sell everything he has, give it to the poor, and then to follow him. And the young ruler, as we know, walks away sad because he was rich. He let his wealth become an obstacle for him. He let it overcome him, and he couldn't follow Jesus because of that. So if we see this as a prequel to the Zacchaeus story, there's tension building up because Zacchaeus is wealthy. He's rich. And having just heard this story, we're wondering, well, is the same thing going to happen to Zacchaeus? And every story starts out with a person in their ordinary world. This is Zacchaeus' world, Jericho, and he's a tax collector. Next part of our script is the inciting incident. Something drastic happens. It's a catalyst. It's the one thing that's going to set every other event in motion, and it's going to change the person's life. And for Zacchaeus, this was Jesus coming through Jericho. And every protagonist has a goal. It's a hope, it's a dream, something they have to get, they have to reach. And the text tells us for Zacchaeus that he wants to see Jesus. That's the most important thing. That's his goal. And after this inciting incident, when the character has a goal, there's an obstacle right away. It's called plot point 1. And there's so many different ways these obstacles can be manifested. In the screenwriting world, we have 5 different conflict or obstacles, as we call them. It can be an inner obstacle, something of our own personal selves that's preventing us. It can be a relational obstacle. It can be a social obstacle. It can be situational, and it can be universal. So this first obstacle Zacchaeus encounters, it's more situational. He's short. And I know it sounds a little funny, but it's true because the crowd is all a lot taller than Zacchaeus, and he can't see over them. So this is an obstacle for him. And there's 2 things he can do. He can either give up, say, well, I can't see Jesus, I'm too short. Or he can fight it. He can find some way around it. He can overcome this obstacle, this limitation that is preventing him from reaching his goal, which is so important to him. And what he does is, he runs ahead of the crowd and he climbs a tree. And this is another important thing to realize because he's overcoming another obstacle by running and climbing a tree. This was seen as undignified. And Zacchaeus was probably a pretty proud man because he's high in status, he's rich. So for him to run, he has to overcome this pride that he might be carrying and disgrace himself and not care what other people think about him by running and climbing a tree. So he runs ahead and he climbs this tree and he gets up there. And Jesus stops right underneath him. He says, Zacchaeus, come down, for I must stay at your house today. So Zacchaeus, he's so excited, he comes down right away. And this is where he has seen Jesus, so he reached that goal. And in overcoming that obstacle, the stakes have changed. Now the new goal is, oh, Jesus is coming to my house. This is amazing. But here another obstacle happens. And this time it's the crowd. The crowd becomes an obstacle because they start complaining. They're trying to prevent Jesus from going to eat at Zacchaeus' house. They're like, he's going to be the guest of a sinner? And this is important because in here, they're taking away from his identity. They don't say, oh, he's going to Zacchaeus' house. They don't give him a name. They don't see him for who he is. They just give him an identity, saying he's a sinner. Often people will project identities onto us and try and use that as a way of stopping us from achieving goals. And this has happened in a couple different ways for me. Firstly, because I'm a woman. So I've had some people say, you shouldn't go into the ministry, you're a woman. Well, I can't let that stop me. They don't look to see if I'm called by God. They don't look to see if I'm capable of doing this. They just give me the identity and say, you can't do this because you're a woman. And I've also had this happen in another way. I'm trying to become a Navy chaplain. And I believe I'm very capable, and so do many others. But the doctors gave me a title of a skin condition. So now that's how I'm labeled. They don't see my name, they don't see anything, but they see this skin condition and say, no, sorry, you can't do this. And the thing is, the skin condition is only a little bit of discoloration. But they don't look past that. They don't see you for who you are, for what you can be. They don't see you as God sees you. They just give you this identity and try and prevent you from doing things. So I'm not letting them prevent me. I am going to be fighting this obstacle as Zacchaeus fights his obstacles, because we cannot let people's perceptions of us prevent us from doing what we need to do. So, what does Zacchaeus do when people call him a sinner? He tries to change their perception. He stops them. He says, "Here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone, I will return to them fourfold." So he's showing, I'm not really a sinner. Look it, I can be different. I can change. And I want to tell you why Zacchaeus was so desperate to have that connection with Jesus, to see Jesus, and now to have him come over to his house. And there's a couple different stories that help show this. And when people really want to see Jesus, it's because they're desperate for something. People were desperate to see Jesus, to hear him teach, because he spoke unlike anyone else at that time. He spoke with such authority, and people came to be healed. And I have noticed that in the stories of healing, people have been the most desperate to reach Jesus and to do anything it takes. In Luke 5, there's a story of 4 friends who are trying to get their bedridden friend to Jesus because he's handicapped and he can't get through. But won't you know it, there's a crowd surrounding Jesus in the house. There's no way they would be able to get in. That's an obstacle. They could have said, well, maybe we'll try coming earlier tomorrow when there's no crowd, if that would even happen. But they pursue, they overcome this obstacle. They climb onto the roof, and they tear the roof apart and drop their friend down through the hole because they're not letting obstacles stand in their way. It's too important. Jesus is too important to let an obstacle stand in the way of that happening. And then later on in Luke, there's a blind man, and he wants to be healed. He knows Jesus has been around, but how can he get to him? Because he's blind. He can't see. He wouldn't be able to even approach. So we hear that this blind man is screaming for Jesus to notice him. He is not letting his eyesight, his lack of eyesight, be an issue. It's not an obstacle, and he pushes past that obstacle. Now, I've had other obstacles like that. When I was a child, I had a speech impediment. I could not say the letter S, and I talked a mile a minute. People could never understand anything I was saying, which was a major obstacle communication-wise. But that obstacle grew in even more. When I was in 3rd grade, we had to give presentations on historical characters in front of our classes. So I had Harriet Tubman, I had dressed up, I had memorized my whole little speech. But when the time came, I was not allowed to give my presentation because of my speech impediment. My teacher made me wait until lunchtime to give it alone with no one else around. Now that's an obstacle because as a child, I was indirectly being taught that my speech was an obstacle. In communication, in public speaking, that my speech was a limitation. But that was not something I accepted. That's an obstacle I overcame. I went to speech therapy. I learned how to articulate and slow down so people can understand what I'm saying. We should not let obstacles prevent us from achieving our goals. So, people who are desperate from healing come to Jesus. And I think Zacchaeus is desperate for healing, not physically from his height, but it's spiritually. And I want to read you a short passage from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted." And I believe that man is Zacchaeus, that tax collector's prayer, that is Zacchaeus, because he's dealing with inner conflict. It's an obstacle in his soul. He knows he's a sinner. He's not happy where his life is, and he wants to be different. And that's why when the crowd is calling him a sinner, it hits close to home, because it was his prayer. It's something he knows, and it's something he wants to change. It's an obstacle that he has to overcome. So Zacchaeus had come down, and he overcame that obstacle. Earlier I said, no one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money. And now we see that Zacchaeus was able to overcome this obstacle. He didn't let money inhibit him from being able to follow Jesus so passionately. So we will all face obstacles in our life, whether they're our own personal obstacles, whether they're limitations that people put on us. The crowd is putting an identity on Zacchaeus without actually looking at him. People will put identities on us that we have to push past as well. Zacchaeus overcomes that obstacle. He is not being limited by others. He overcame his inner obstacles. And look what happens. Jesus says, "Today salvation has come to this house." Now imagine if Zacchaeus just gave up because of his height. So he has overcome, and we can rejoice in that, because if Zacchaeus can overcome these obstacles, if he can overcome his internal battles, his physical battles, social battles, all these obstacles, if he can overcome them, we can also overcome obstacles that are set before us. No matter how big of an obstacle we think they are, we can overcome them. So what obstacles have you been fighting lately? And are you going to let these obstacles limit you from pursuing God's calling or other goals and dreams you have? Are you going to fight these obstacles and hear God say, "Today salvation has come to this house"? Amen.